Hello, welcome to the State Bar of Texas International Law Section and the SMU Rowling Center for Business Law and Leadership Global Pathways, Exploring Careers in International Law. We're really excited to have you here. We have a great panel, and we're going to explore their journeys in international law and being an international law practitioner. Letting you know, we will have and take questions, so you can use your chat, put some questions in there. We can take them at the end. If you have something that's really urgent, just put it right in whenever you think of it, and we can get to them. And I may, actually use them during, but we do have time saved at the end for you to ask questions. The mission of the International Law Section is to develop the practice of international law in Texas, to bring an international perspective to the Texas bar, and to help ILS members be impactful and successful in their careers. You can follow us on LinkedIn at the ilstexas.org website. And so those are useful places for you to go look for us. Today, we're going to explore with these panelists how they navigated their international legal careers, some of their challenges, what they wish they'd known when they were law students, and that sort of thing. I'm Demetra Koelling. I'm treasurer for the ILS and general counsel and risk officer of Ontoit Cybersecurity, which is a global provider of managed cybersecurity services. I graduated from UT Law decades ago. I've been in-house at lots of different companies in operational roles and in legal roles. And most of those companies, including my current one, were multinational, and I've had responsibilities, legal and operational, in all sorts of jurisdictions. And we'll find out in a little bit if that makes me an international lawyer. So I'm happy to welcome you. And first, before we dive in, I'm going to ask Marisa Sandoval Rodriguez, our president of the ILS group, to share with you one quick item of interest for you to think about, and then we'll dive right into the panelists.
All right. Thank you, Demetra. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to remind you, in case you haven't already heard about it, but the ILS, we sponsor every year a scholarship, and so it is a human rights essay contest, and the submission date is March 15th. So if anybody's interested in doing a human rights essay and a chance to win a $1,500 scholarship, then we ask you to please submit your essay by the March 15th deadline, and we hope to receive many and to continue this project throughout the years. So you can contact any of us if you have any questions about it. Feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. I really appreciate that. So we'll dive right into the panel and hear what they have to say. First, I want to introduce Eric Hinton. Probably some of you or many of you know Eric as director of the SMU Rowling Center for Business Law and Leadership. He's the founding director, and he teaches international business law, so maybe you've had a course, and also teaches EU law and ethics. And he has over 25 years in global law and compliance, and he's held senior roles at Fortune 100 companies and also private equity-backed firms, and was chief ethics officer and a compliance officer at a major franchisor. He's a fellow at the SMU Hunt Institute and holds multiple law degrees. So something for you to aspire to. He's published lots of scholarly articles on international law and compliance. Thank you, Eric, for hosting us.
Thank you.
And then we also have with us, and so I'm going to just introduce everybody kind of quickly and then ask a question, and then that will fill out kind of who they really are, other than this quick bio. I'll next introduce Ivan Castaneda. He is stepping in for Hal Dampier, who couldn't be here today. Thank you, Ivan, for showing up and helping us with this panel. And Ivan practices corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, real estate planning, and related areas for his clients. with interests in Mexico and the United States. He does a lot of the commercial contracts, intellectual property, trademark registrations, and that sort of thing. So he has a lot of experience advising clients with matters in a wide array of jurisdictions, whether they're looking to initiate cross-border trade or investment projects. He was educated in both Texas and Mexico and is licensed to practice law in both Texas and Mexico. And next we have Cynthia Rigney. She's with BT Americas. She's a principal lawyer there of regulatory and compliance, the Americas, based in Dallas. She manages a team of regulatory expert compliance professionals, and she has deep expertise in managing legal risks, labor and employment, and regulatory matters. She ensures compliance in these really fast-paced telecommunications sector. So she has her JD from UT Law. Daniel Avila is a senior associate at Reed Smith, and he specializes in international arbitration, transnational investment law, and complex commercial litigation. Got to say, most commercial litigation seems to be complex, but that's just my perspective. As part of the firm's Latin American business team, Daniel assists clients on dispute resolution matters across the region in both English and Spanish. Daniel earned his JD from the University of Houston Law Center and his LLM in international dispute resolution at Queen Mary University of London. If I could do accents, I would have done that in an English accent. But let's get right into it now. We're doing this panel on international law, and we're the ILS, the international law section of the bar. What does it mean to be an international lawyer from your perspective? What makes you that? Why is this of interest to you, and that sort of thing? So I'll start with you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Demetra. Well, in my case, as you already mentioned, I'm dual licensed, so my interest in international law begins since high school, where I was about to study.
Oops, did we lose you?
Yeah, it looks like it froze.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, for the minute, we'll come back to you, and I'm going to just ask Eric, can you tell us a bit from your perspective as an international lawyer, what is that for you?
Sure. And I'm going to give a statement first that I'm not really a professor or academic. I'm actually an international business law practitioner in a whole lot of areas, but I happen to be at a law school and teach. So, what does it mean to be an international lawyer? I like to tell my students, and this is somewhat related to international business side, there's not really international business law. They're just international business transactions. And I think in general, you'll find that's often the case when you're dealing with contracts or compliance issues, or otherwise you're dealing with some specific jurisdiction. So what is it to be an international lawyer? I think it's basically a process as much as a substance. So it's someone who has to spot issues, to be able to think about problems across the border, and then have a network of counsel or otherwise to rely on so that you can solve problems. Also, if you're the kind of person that likes everything to fall in a box where you can control and manage it, then international business law or otherwise is not for you.
Well, that's a good point. Cynthia, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think I echo what you said during your introduction is, you deal with a lot of work in different jurisdictions, and does that make you an international lawyer? I don't know, but that's exactly what I do. I've been with BT for about 3.5 years, started out doing the employment and litigation over the Americas, so US, Canada, and a handful of countries in Latin America. So, and now I do the same, but on the regulatory and compliance side for the Americas. So a lot of work in different countries, which requires me to, become a mini expert in the law of, that specific country on that specific issue that comes before me. see it also on the commercial litigation side, working for a global company like BT. Sometimes you have a dispute and the very first question ends up being, what's the jurisdiction that you have to, potentially litigate that issue. So sometimes that ends up changing your strategy, I'll say. So for me, it's exactly what you said. I don't know that I do a lot of international law. It's working in different jurisdictions across the Americas region is what I do.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Daniel.
Yeah, I think international law is a broad umbrella. There's going to be different aspects, different parts of it. I think the two big areas are going to be public international law and private international law. And public international law, I would say, is more human rights, countries, political, more diplomacy, where it's probably not as common to find a career in that, I would say, unless you were working at maybe an embassy or the consulate or the government. And then there's trade disputes on tariffs and all kinds of things like that, where again, another area that's just not, I would say, it's not as common, again, unless you're working with the government or you're working at a consulate or you're working with diplomats. And then there's a huge umbrella of private international law that you see every day. And yes, it usually is related to businesses, but it can be starting off with immigration. I would argue that immigration is also under this private international law. And then you can obviously have, your family-based immigration and your business-based immigration where companies are recruiting individuals to work at their companies from other countries. And then you have a little bit of mix between public and international and private, which would be investment arbitration. And that would be bringing disputes under treaties that countries signed, but that investors have privy through dispute resolution clauses that are in the treaty. So our firm, Reed Smith, does that a lot. So that would be, for example, you have an investment in Venezuela, say an oil rig, you've invested millions of dollars, infrastructure, and then a new president comes in and then tells you to leave and takes your assets and takes everything and just says, this is our oil and you need to go figure it out. And that's what happened in many cases in many countries when you see these radical changes in presidents and administrations. And fortunately, if there is a treaty that is covered under those projects, and you can bring a case under a treaty such as what used to be NAFTA, now the USMCA, or bilateral investment treaties between those countries. So we see a lot of that, those kind of investment arbitrations. And arbitration, for those who don't know on this call, is simply, it's litigation. It's just in a private area. In other words, it's not at a court. It's not at a, downtown. It's at a private venue. You pick an arbitrator, they pick an arbitrator, and then those arbitrators pick a president of the tribunal. And the goal is to make it as neutral as possible. So I would say that's the closest area that's kind of touches public and private, because you're dealing with what countries are doing and what laws they might be enacting, and kind of the balance between how country has its own autonomy to pass its laws, but also not mess with your investment if it's protected and you were brought in under certain promises. And then I would say, yes, absolutely.
I was just going to say that's a really cool distinction between public and private, that international work. It's a very cool distinction. I interrupted you though, if you wanted to.
No. And what I would say about that public is that, yeah, it's very interesting because you're literally bringing a case against the country. You see the attorney general on these cases, personally managing these cases. But again, yeah, you do have that balance of, what can a country do and what is arbitrary and what isn't. You see cases, for example, just a quick example, in Uruguay, where the country was enacting kind of measures to prevent people or disencourage people from smoking. So they would have, you might see it if you go into Latin American countries, you'll see a cigarette box and it'll have like someone dying of, some sort of gum disease or something like
Yeah.
that. So, the country is trying to be healthy and trying to de-incentivize buying that. But of course, you have now a private investor, Philip Morris, who is losing money. This is their investment. You weren't doing this when you invited them to come invest in your country, and now you're destroying their investment. So it's a balance that these tribunals have to manage. And the last thing I would say is on international law is which is more and more common. I think you'll see the most of is commercial international arbitration. So that would be under a contract. So you have maybe a construction project between a Mexican entity and a U.S. entity, and you don't want to end up in Mexican courts, and they don't want to end up in Texas courts. So they end up agreeing to an arbitration. And those arbitrations are usually much more formalistic than your domestic arbitration that you might see under AAA law, AAA rules here in the US. They're almost like overly formalistic because you're kind of merging two different systems, the civil law and common law, and you're trying to find a middle ground. Like there's no depositions, but there is discovery, where discovery isn't that common in Mexico or civil law jurisdictions. So you're kind of managing that. You're going against Mexican counsel if it's a Mexican case under Mexican law. So those are, I think, are an area of law that's never going to leave, because companies that are doing investments and doing projects in Latin America or other countries want to be protected and don't want to end up in those courts. Whereas in investor state arbitration, I feel like that's kind of pushing back, because these countries are now realizing the exposure they have. So you're seeing these treaties being renegotiated. You see now the USMCA was renegotiated from NAFTA that removed a lot of protections that investors had. So those are I guess the umbrellas I would say that I see in my practice.
They're really interesting umbrellas, and thank you for that. So Yvonne, now that you're back, I think, can you tell us what drew you to international law? Why did you decide, okay, I'm a Mexican lawyer, I want to come, and I have so many clients in the US or whatever. I'm not sure what it is that you come at it from a little bit different perspective, but you're an international lawyer and licensed in Texas. And so what drew you to being this international person?
I will say that it was twofold. Since I was in high school, I really liked history, and I was about to be a historian rather than a lawyer. So I've been always interested in different cultures. So when I made up my mind study law, I never wanted to lose that international component, that cultural aspect that always interested me. So when I had the opportunity to study abroad, and it came somewhat late because my school in Mexico, it didn't have, or at least back then, didn't have exchange programs as is more common by the day today. I always wanted to get a degree in another country. So when I finally got accepted in UT Austin, and that's why I say that it was twofold, because when I joined UT Austin, it was amazing. I got to know people from, I think that over 20 countries, different cultures, different aspects of that international law. And for me, it's not just about the law and the different legal systems. It's also about the cultures. It's also about educating people that want to do business in either countries where I'm licensed. Because even though that we're neighbors and we had a very strong relationship throughout history, our cultures and our legal system are quite different. So that's a component that it's always been there for me, like getting to know it and also try to share that knowledge that I'm acquiring through this process. So I don't know if
no, that's super helpful. Thank you. So, and I'm curious, and Cynthia, we'll circle back to you, and then maybe Eric on this, and I'll ask a couple of questions just to see if you have any because you do a lot of practice across different time zones and different legal systems, which we've already discussed. But, so just curious about what are these like obstacles, challenges? How do you work, sort of as an international lawyer in different systems with different cultures? And that sort of thing. So that's a lot. That's like 3 questions. How do you like tactically manage all these different time zones? That kind of thing, and the different cultures and that sort of thing. And I'm just curious, like operationally, how's your day? Like, what does it look like when you have all of these different things going on?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the things I enjoy most about my job. We are a British company, so if you're working with the UK team, you're going to have a lot of very early morning calls. Usually, they are kind enough to not have a 6 a.m. call, but sometimes it happens. And then working even with LATAM, Brazil can be 3 hours ahead of Dallas time. So I've definitely had situations where I'm on a 7 a.m. call working US holidays because they're not a holiday everywhere. So you kind of have to flex, but that's kind of the fun is my day can be, start with a call with the UK team. And then I switch to a call in Portuguese with external counsel in Brazil. So to Yvonne's point, the international aspect and the different cultures, that's what makes this kind of work really fun because starting, I think Daniel was talking about it too, right, is the civil versus common law. When I had inherited this docket of labor litigation cases in Brazil, I had to learn what the legal process is in Brazil. I had no reason to know it before I had these 15 cases, but you learn about it very quickly, and that, helps. You can't kind of just come to it with like a US perspective. This is how litigation works in the US, therefore this is how I operate in these countries. You have to be flexible. You have to show an understanding of the system, the culture. And so that really, to me, is what's exciting, is that there's, I can touch on different jurisdictions in a single day, and switch from English to Spanish to Portuguese, whatever. It's just what makes it kind of exciting and makes it not boring. I'm never doing the same thing, on from one day to the next.
That's awesome. So you touched on a few things there that I found interesting, and Eric and Daniel and Yvonne, I just wonder, do you lean on, so when you're operating and you have business operations in a different country, do you lean on your internal, like your HR staff, to kind of help you with sort of the basics, and maybe outside counsel to sort of guide you? It seems like sort of like doing a cold learn. I mean, do you lean on other people to help you, and then you learn it and become, it's this on the job learning? Is there a lot of that in your life? Eric, was there a lot of that in your life when you're with customers or clients? Sorry.
Sure. And I've been in, or was in house for many, many years in a lot of different aspects, including 4 years as general counsel in Brussels, which is a different kind of question. I wouldn't say, though, that ultimately your process is really that much different than it would be if it's entirely domestic. What I would say, though, is that you rely on your business partners and your outside counsel to really help you with the culture and maybe the more nuanced things that apply in an international perspective that wouldn't be there in a domestic process.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to me because it seems like it could be daunting to think, oh, I've got to know so much about everything or I'll get us in trouble. And what I wonder about that fear factor, I guess, how do you deal with that, Daniel? The sort of like, oh my God, do I really know what I'm doing? Because there's so much to know. Like I have the new matter, I need to handle it for my client. I know them institutionally. I know, I know the contract. So how do you deal with sort of that, knowing that you've got to learn something and figuring out how to learn it?
Yeah, I think it's rarely a law issue because, at least in investor state arbitration, you're dealing more with what the treaties and what arbitral awards have said. And so it's not necessarily like trying to figure out Portuguese law as much. I think what's more difficult is, being in different type of construction disputes that might involve different energy and different like just very, very technical disputes. It's almost like IP litigation where you're becoming an engineer on the job and you're really having to dive into that. And I think what we usually do is just have very hands-on workshops with the engineers within the company, within the client's company, for any of the technical things that we need to really, really grasp on. But aside from that, if it's like a Mexico dispute with the Mexican law, we definitely, we'll take a first stab at it, but we usually work with local counsel on these cases, making sure that everything we're doing is correct and it's what we understand it being. But yeah, I would say there's a big difference in kind of like your federal court or state court litigation and international arbitration, whereas it's more focused on factual, like it's a big memorial, hundreds of pages, but the law part isn't as relevant as the factual is. Whereas in state and federal court, it's more law and you're focused more on what the law says and how it applies. So I think that's how I guess we manage it. Or I
Yvonne, do you find it, from your perspective and observation, helpful to be so fluent in both languages? Have you observed any sort of obstacles to peers or colleagues who may not have mastered both? Is this sort of language skills? Cynthia, you talked about doing it in Portuguese. Daniel, you just mentioned that as well. And I'm thinking, wow, we have a very, very interesting panel. And I'm just wondering, Yvonne, from your perspective, are language skills particularly useful?
Those are essential. And just a piece of advice for whoever is in a similar position that I am, you will never lose that sense of that concern about a second language. English for me is a second language. So it always be in your head, like, am I speaking properly? It's people really understanding what I want to say. And it just gets better by practicing it. So yes, being bilingual is essential, in my opinion, in international law and generally in the world that we're living right now. But if you can have more than two languages, even better. If you have, for instance, a Mexican father and an American mother, then try and learn both languages and then try and learn a third one. But not only that, you keep practicing it in every chance that you have. If you have some forums or some friends that speak that language, go in and just try to do it. Even if at first you're not great, just keep doing it until you're somewhat proficient. So yeah.
Interesting. Does that help you as well, Cynthia, to be able to understand or speak the language?
Absolutely. I think it was something that came as a strength for me, being, English is my second language, although I'm much more proficient in English now than in Spanish. But that came obviously handy with operating in Latin American countries. But I decided early on into working in Brazil to also take Portuguese classes, because I felt that when I was getting updates from external counsel in English, I felt like I was missing something, like something was getting lost in translation, literally. And so it was frustrating for me. And so I took the step to learn Portuguese formally, with lessons and doing assignments and everything, because it just closed that gap in my understanding, but also the relationship with external counsel just got that much stronger, and with my colleagues in Brazil, because I know that Yvonne said you never get that thing in your mind that says, are you saying this right or not? But from my colleagues in Brazil and external counsel in Brazil, they're so kind because they just get a kick out of me trying to speak Portuguese. And so I think it has improved my understanding. So from, you know, the professional perspective, it's been a strength and an asset, but also from the relationship building aspect, it's been, you know, it's added a lot of value as well.
That's interesting. And I noted, Eric, that you talked about having lived and worked in Belgium and Brussels. And I note, because I work for a Dutch company, that Dutch is a very difficult language, and Brussels has, you know, so many people doing French and English and Dutch and many other things. And so there's cultural issues there along with the language issues. And what is your sort of feedback on how you feel like that works in terms of sort of those culture dynamics and the language dynamics, and particularly when you're living in a country like that?
Sure, and I'll add too. So I have a Master's of Arts from a school in Ireland, and then I studied in Paris. I also have an LLM from Leiden in the Netherlands, right? And then the Brussels part, right? So right. You know Leiden well. So it's beautiful. I want to go back to the language issue because English is hard enough for me, right? Well, I would just say many people don't have additional language, and you'll find that maybe amongst the number of our participants. So I don't want you to think that if you don't have another language that you can't be an international lawyer. And what I would say is, especially in like a European Union or a EMEA, so, you know, it's covering Africa, Middle East, and Europe, or if you have global responsibilities, there's no way you're going to know all of those languages. I will say that being in Brussels, I became relatively proficient in French and in, Dutch. I don't really speak the Flemish version very well, but that was helpful. But ultimately, unless you're truly bilingual, you should never try to practice law or review contracts, in my opinion, in those languages. It's helpful, I think, as Cynthia mentioned, to navigate the cultural issues and you know, have a certain rapport with your partners. Although in all the teams I've been on, they're international, so there's the only common language really is English. But ultimately, you shouldn't be doing anything really that relates to, in my opinion, counseling or reviewing contracts as relates to law. Is what your outside counsel is one of the things you're able to help you with. So to the cultural issues, I think those are important. I think it's okay to make mistakes, realize that you will, and be humble about it, but also give yourself some grace on that. And you'll find other people make mistakes too. That's one of the interesting things, maybe even fun things that you see when you're dealing with a multinational executive team, for instance.
Well, you'll have to talk to my boss about this, not reviewing languages, not reviewing contracts languages, because I do it every day.
Tell him I said don't do that, because
I will.
Yeah.
Outside counsel, 100%. We do have a process to kind of help us with that, but what I found the language of our company is primarily English. Most of our contracts are in English, but not all of them. In the Netherlands, they have some form contracts. The government has put out sort of standard, you know, ICT contracts and these provisions. And so you understand what they are. They also put them out in English and Dutch and that sort of thing. So easy to learn, and you understand what the law of that jurisdiction is. And when you're negotiating, Daniel, you probably know this all the time, right? When you're negotiating liability or indemnity or whatever, you're always fighting about sort of similar issues and similar things. And so I have found it to be somewhat easy to do. I don't do the actual redlining. I only do it in English. I send it over in English. We have a conversation in English. The contract gets fixed in the native language. We have a translator on our team who's, you know, American Dutch, and she does the review to make sure it's what I intended, because it's in Dutch. But that's our only real check and balance. So far, 5 years, we've been okay with that. But I think normally that's good advice.
Demetra, can I just add one thing about the codes? You mentioned this, and this is important, especially for common law trained people. I mean, there's such a big misunderstanding. I think Cynthia mentioned this about how the civil law works. And that's one thing you'll see is relatively short agreements that incorporate by reference some provisions of the code. And, here in the United States, we basically write every contingency into a single agreement just in case it happens, and Daniel has to deal with it later down the road. But you'll find in a lot of civil law jurisdictions that they'll, refer to the real estate code or about a lease or maybe the commercial code or whatever. And that's an interesting distinction.
Yes, I do think it is. And so we'll kind of move on to sort of this next category of ideas and really focusing on the law school experience and focusing on sort of the choices you made as a law student, and maybe briefly about your journey from, me just doing the standard, what do I need to do to pass the Texas bar stuff, and maybe a little bit heavy on electives on sort of some business side stuff. But I didn't really know what I was doing. And frankly, for me, it just, kind of worked out in a different way. But I really want to hear your stories about, your law school experience. Did you become an international lawyer? We have an attorney who's asking us, hey, how do I transition into this international law stuff? And, what do I do and how can that help? But I'm interested first sort of in this law school experience and what you focused on. Was there anything in particular that was useful for you, Daniel, in law school that really reinforced this for you?
Yeah, I would say I had a really good mentor at the University of Houston. He was a Venezuelan diplomat named Julian Cardenas, who was really good about helping me kind of map how I'm going to get into what I wanted to do. So I think the first huge thing that helped my career and get into international arbitration was I did a clerkship in the summer in Bogota, Colombia, for 5 weeks at the biggest law firm there. It's called Brigada Rutia. And it helped my profile just kind of show that, hey, I'm able to work in Spanish, work in disputes in Spanish. And now we have a huge docket for our Latin clients or just multinationals that have disputes in Latin American arbitration, where here in Houston, we're handling them and they're in Spanish and they're under Mexican law or they're under Colombian law. And we're going against counsel in Mexico in Spanish. And we're able to do that, and we're able to show the client that, hey, look, you don't have to get local counsel in Mexico. Here Reed Smith Houston can handle that for you. So I think that was a huge step for me. And I think, I did a Spanish moot court as well in law school. It was a moot court on investor arbitration, and it was in Spanish, and we went against schools against all over Latin America, Argentina, Uruguay, Guatemala. So that was a really good experience. But I think aside from those two experiences, I think just being able to study international arbitration and investment law arbitration in law school really helped establish those fundamentals that are hard to teach first-year associates that are coming into our firm. If you've never heard of that, you've never done that, it's very hard because it's an uphill battle, uphill learning curve, and sometimes it's just not. It gets to a point where it's not worth the client's time to try to teach a first year all these different fundamental principles. So I was very fortunate that when I was in law school, I think I took one bar class after one out, and the rest were all international. So I took literally 2 years of just international law, and I think I took secure transactions, and other than that, I relied on Barbary, and it worked out.
Oh, yeah. Well, I am not L from the So, I was like, how hard can it be? I studied. I took every bar course. Yvonne, to springboard off of what Daniel said, very interesting to me, one of the comments that he made about law school and participating in the International Moot Court and doing that in that language. And I'm interested because one of the things you said earlier was how many people you met from so many other countries in law school when you were at UT Law, and that I don't know, but I presume those are still colleagues of yours in different ways. And does that beyond the experience of showcasing that, one, getting the self-confidence that, yeah, I can do this in a different language or in a different forum that's foreign. What is the value of that law school experience where you're meeting people from all these other countries and, that sort of thing for you? What was it like?
I think the most valuable experience that I got, there were plenty, but if I have to single point one, it'll be that soft skill that you learn when treating people from different cultures to not come out hard. There are some people that they want to be outgoing and leading the conversations and whatnot. And for some cultures, for instance, for Japanese people or for Chinese people, you might come too hard to them and they might just close. So when you get that type of experiences with different kind of people, you learn to observe first, listen first, and then without really changing your personality, I'm not talking about that, but adapting your personality. That there will be people that will appreciate us Mexicans that you be, more open, more somewhat aggressive, but there are people who will not. And you don't get that feeling until you actually meet people from different countries. So I will think that's one of those soft skills that is not necessarily connected to what you will learn in law school, but and in my case, in my original law school in Mexico, we didn't really have a lot of international programs or anything. So you need to look for those opportunities yourself. If the opportunity does not exist, then you create it.
Right.
So that's what I will point out.
Okay. And Cynthia, anything about law school or your experiences there that maybe, you have the takeaway, for the students that are on this call?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important in law school is it's a great opportunity to try different things out, right? I mean, I took an oil and gas class. I took secure transactions. I probably didn't do, I did the opposite of what Daniel did. I did not take every international law course available to me because that wasn't, the plan I had mapped out for myself. I went to law school fully intending on practicing immigration after I graduated, and I did for 5 years. But I think that kind of shows that you don't have to necessarily take courses and then lead to a career that connects to the courses you took. I think it's about the experience, showing curiosity. I would say take different kinds of courses to get an idea of what you think you're going to enjoy. And I think, those are strengths that you can point to in your resume, or when you're interviewing for a career, you can say, I took this course. What I really liked about it was, but I would say that that's the key part, right? Don't just say, I took this course, therefore I can do this job or I can do this internship. Be able to explain what you enjoyed about it, or what, you learned from it that you weren't expecting to learn. But I would say I took my law school route was very unconventional, and it did not lead me to this path. I kind of stumbled on this career that I'm in right now, unintentionally, but very happily.
Right. So that's an interesting point. And Eric, you've done so many different kinds of things in your career, in different countries and different kinds of like investments and in-house. And, it's quite interesting. And I you've pivoted or navigated this area in such an interesting way. And I think that it would be helpful for you to say to somebody, how do you get into international law? How have you navigated your career, and what were some of the key factors for you in being able to grow in new and different directions?
That makes sense. And I see there was a question in the Q&A that asked a similar thing. This is what I would say. If you're in law school and you want the train to drive up in front and take you away to international law career, that's not going to happen. And so I think number one, you have to be very deliberative about finding a career in international law. I think you need to also be prepared for the possibility that it may not work out that way for you and have a backup plan. For me, and I'm not from an international background from the way I grew up. It was the opposite, really. But I knew I was interested. And so the way I did it was through international education. I think most law schools don't teach a lot of international law, or at least not at a very deep level. So it gives you just some familiarity. But if you want to learn more, you really need to maybe go do a summer abroad. You could, like I did, do actual degrees in another country. I studied the European Union and the EU law. That was really helpful given the nature of the EU. And then go into international company, or maybe an NGO, or maybe an international organization, or even the U.S. government. A little dysfunctional right now, but in general, the U.S. government's a great place to start learning about international law. As far as pivoting, I think you just need to be flexible and, as I said, take risks and be prepared to not know everything and to be curious, intellectually curious, as well as maybe even willing to move around. If you want to stay in Dallas or Houston, well, maybe Houston works, but you really need to go where the jobs are in order to take advantage of international opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So I think that to sort of springboard off what you said, we have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll ask you about one, and that's are there resources for people to go study abroad, or maybe even work abroad if you're already an attorney? I mean, obviously, yes, there are. A lot of programs are already in English if you do not have a second language. I mean, obviously, you can go to Europe if you want to learn and be around people who, like you, when you were living in Brussels, who are doing all sorts of things at NGOs or courts or that sort of thing. It's amazing. I will say that until we lived in Europe for several years in The Hague, we never imagined that would happen or that we could do it. And my husband was recruited to run one of the UN tribunals. We went there, and I met all sorts of Texans, all sorts of Texas lawyers from Dallas and all Houston and San Antonio and all sorts of places who were doing all sorts of jobs that I'd never even heard of. You know, I'm just like, what? You're doing what? And there's a lot of the international tribunals that, you know, they all have their jobs online, and you can apply. You can just literally apply. It's you know, you should consult with someone who does this. And I was able to get a role at one of the international courts, a temporary role, but boy, did I learn a lot. Anyway, so there are some of those. And internships abroad here. There's another question there, and I'll let you guys talk about that. But we have created a resource, and Marisa, I don't know, we created it for a different seminar that we did about, you know, listing, I don't know, 10 pages worth of internships that you can find abroad. And I don't know if that's on our website but we can certainly make it available. We have it. You know, Daniel, I'll go to you next and ask you about sort of the ILS and just thinking about some of these things, like these resources and these students and student involvement, and maybe this organization and what that might do, you know, just in terms of how they meet people, in terms of resources and ideas, like meeting somebody like Eric, who's done so many different things, or Cynthia, who was an immigration lawyer and now does other things. I don't know if you have any guidance for people on, you know, what organizations they should be involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it really depends on what you're trying to do. In my case, if you're looking for international arbitration, um, Texas is actually very fortunate because there's the Institute for Transnational Arbitration, the ITA, which is a huge organization that's recognized globally. And it's actually based out of Plano initially. And has a huge conference in the, I won't say January, for energy arbitration in Houston. And then there's an annual conference that used to be in Plano. Then it went to Fort Worth, then it went to Austin, and now it's in Houston for this year. But I think it's going to go back to Austin. So the Institute for Transnational Arbitration, the ITA, that's a really great organization. It's in Dallas for those people that are in Dallas. And then there's the Houston. I'm sure there's going to be. I'm in Houston, so I know there's an international law section at the Houston bar. I assume there's one for the Dallas bar. But the Texas international section is also incredible. They have a great summit that they're doing every year. I think this year is in Dallas. And yeah, there's so many practices there. But being involved in these, taking leadership positions, taking volunteer positions, people need bodies to move these organizations because they're free, they're not getting paid. So being able to just have visibility and making those connections, you never know, what doors that can open. So I think those are great organizations. The ITA, ICC, which is an institution, but they do a lot of events. But yeah, those are the ones that I'm familiar with, at least.
Mm-hmm. So it's twofold, isn't it, Yvonne? It's building your own personal network of colleagues, of friends, people you stay in touch with, not just because of what they can give you, but what you can learn from them and what you can help them with maybe down the road. But also there's the idea of learning about different institutions. Like Daniel, you just mentioned some right here in Texas. People are thinking, oh, I need to go abroad. Well, maybe if you focus here, it might be there are organizations or institutions, and you learn about those. I mean, randomly, and sometimes, through colleagues and that sort of thing. I mean, Yvonne, can you address any sort of networking strategies for lawyers or students who want to enhance or possibly get into being an international practitioner?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that you need to look for forums or associations or that resonate with you. If you have a certain background, for instance, the Mexican American Bar Association, in my case, go there, involve, and attend to their events intendedly. Not just go there and get the CLE. No, get to meet people, go out of your comfort zone, and you will be surprised. There are plenty of programs, plenty of scholarships out there, not only in your country of origin in the US, but on the country of destination if you want to get a program abroad. That will be like great opportunities for you to develop all of this. So in short, the idea will be to get involved and look for opportunities. Use Google, use ChatGPT, use whatever tool you like to use.
Right.
But there are plenty of associations out there that will be of interest to you in this type of aspects.
Yeah, and I do think that yes, Google is your friend, because in many ways, there's organizations you've never heard of, and typing in, how do I become an international lawyer? What organizations are in Houston or Austin or wherever you are to help you with that, right?
The consulate, if you want, like, I want to study abroad in Germany, reach out to the consulate of Germany, and you will be surprised of how many resources you can get from them.
Yes.
Yes.
And how many German universities actually provide teaching in English, for example?
Mm-hmm.
My daughter
Exactly.
studied in Vienna. My other daughter studied, they studied, like, they got degrees there, and it was so much cheaper than the United States. But until I lived in Europe, I would never have thought. I would just assumed everything was too expensive, too hard to get to. You have to fly too far. It's not a thing. but it is a thing. And once you're there and you kind of like Eric, you've lived there, you realize there's so many opportunities for education and work, but how do you know about them sitting wherever, So sometimes you just take that risk. We only have a few more minutes, and we do have, I just wanted to give each of you a chance to just circle through and just anything that's kind of been percolating in your mind, sort of a key takeaway for you for what you wish you'd known, what would you like to impart? And again, those resources you can email me or the ILS because we definitely have long lists for you of potential international opportunities. So we'll start, Daniel, with you, and then we'll just go around and just sort of try to wrap up.
Yeah, I would say if you have a very good, I guess, experience with another language, like Spanish, for example, I would take the time while you're in law school to really try to perfect it, really try to perfect your writing as well, because it opens up a lot of doors, And here at Reed Smith, we're always looking for junior associates where we have to work with Miami, we have to work with New York, because there wasn't enough in Texas that really not just spoke or fluent, but were able to write legal writing in Spanish. So I think if you are interested in that, that is one. And then two would be to try to expand your horizon and study abroad or work abroad to create a profile and connections to open up your doors for that.
Perfect. Eric, do you have any key takeaways and I guess we don't have just students, we have lawyers here, key takeaways for them in terms of how to either network or anything, based on the conversation.
Sure. Overall, I think this is good for anything, is find someone who has the job you want and go talk to them and find out how they got there.
Cool.
The other thing is, don't be afraid to cold call people and to just reach out. No one's going to be offended, and if they are, you didn't want to talk to them anyway.
Yeah. Cynthia.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo what Eric said. I think you'll have a great opportunity in law school to be curious and try out a lot of different areas. But wholeheartedly echo what Eric said in terms of contacting people that have the job that you're interested in. I was a mentor to somebody in law school, and he shadowed me at work for a day, so maybe a job is not going to come out of it. Maybe an internship is not going to come out of it, but at least it gives you a day in the life of, and you can get an idea of whether that's what you like. You might like in-house, you might like law firm experience, but absolutely don't be afraid to reach out, network, make the connections. But when you do, make sure that you invest the time to make that connection work for you, and that you give, if someone's giving of their time to talk to you, make sure that you come prepared for that as well. Because as Eric said, they're going to want to talk to you. If they don't sweat it. But if they want to talk to you, make sure that you are respectful of the time that they're giving to show you around, give you their tips, give you their advice, etc.
Exactly. Also, if you're talking with someone from a different country, Google some of their customs, and truly Google is your friend, YouTube, whatever. It will make all of the difference for you to understand that the style of a person from a particular country.
I wanted to say one comment before I forget, and I think it's very important, is when you apply to law firms that might have international law or might have a branch of it, I would be more focused on a broader approach, because if you focus on, hey, I'm only interested in international arbitration, for example, or only interested in international law, well, they might not have at the moment a big capacity of work for that area. And if they're thinking, oh, that's all this person wants to do, then it doesn't work. Whereas if you just said, I'm interested in disputes, for example, in commercial litigation, whatever, I'm interested in disputes generally. well, and you know that that firm has it, for example, any big firm, whatever, then you can get in. And once you're in the door, then you can make the relationships with those people and start building up that flow of work. But I wouldn't pigeonhole yourself. I pigeonholed myself when I was going through OCI. I got very lucky. We got one firm that actually called my bluff or what I wanted to do, but it's very much closed a lot of doors. So I would definitely suggest keeping it broad.
And I do think that keeping it broad, being flexible, learning by doing this, attending these webinars, and networking and getting involved in groups and organizations that are of interest to you. For example, me with privacy law. But I want to thank you. We're out of time. I want to thank you. I want to remind you, we do still have the you can go to the ilstexas.org .org website for the civil rights essay scholarship opportunity. We appreciate your time. Thank you, Eric, for hosting us. And, see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.